Well, in a few minutes, with a lot of technology and a little luck, we'll be crossing live to Lone Pine to hear those historic speeches by Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Opposition Leader Dr John Hewson. Speeches in which the two leaders will seek to link the Anzac legend of the past with the Australia of today and tomorrow. And here in Canberra, we'll try to examine those links too, asking questions like, are we, the Australians of today, really different because of the heroic nightmare of Gallipoli 75 years ago? To tackle such questions, I've been joined by Professor Manning Clark, our nation's most eminent historian, and Bill Gammage, historical advisor to the film Gallipoli and author of The Broken Years, a study of the diggers in the Great War. As I said, we'll be crossing live to Lone Pine at any moment, but first, what were they like and who were they? Those young men who landed at Anzac Cove on that ominously still morning in 1915. Here's an extract from the Four Corners documentary, The Fatal Shore.
You had that feeling that you had to go. That's the feeling I had, and I was in pretty good nick too. As the bloke said at the recruiting offices, by Joseph, says, you're in pretty good nick. So I should be.
So I went up this line there, and I was rejected on account of my height. Not medically, but on account of my height. What I did, I walked right round, got to the other end of the other line, and went up and was passed through in the one hall in the one time.
Living in Port Melbourne, you notice all these passenger ships going abroad, and that's one thing I did have in mind. I'd love to be on one of those ships one of these days. Little did I know that there was going to be a war on, and little did I know I was going to be in a uniform.
And the band played waltzing Matilda as the ship pulled away from the quay. And amidst all the cheers, the flag waving and tears, we sailed off for Gallipoli.
Well, Bill Gammage, what were those young men like and why did they set sail? Was it adventure, patriotism, what?
Well, I think they would have felt patriotism and duty, of course, especially after they enlisted. There's always a beer in those sorts of emotions, and they genuinely did feel them. But if I had to put my finger on one thing, I'd say that they were fit young men and confident. Of course, ignorant about what was going to happen, but confident that they were going to win.
And off for a big adventure?
Off for a big adventure, more or less like being odds-on in a grand final, I'd say.
Manning Clark, the British commander, General Hamilton, described them as gladiators with the eye of children. This implies a sort of innocence abroad, doesn't it? And this has been part of the story for generations.
Yeah, well, I think, you see, every generation, Paul, creates the past in its own image. It sees itself reflected in the past. And I think the way people immediately after Gallipoli saw these chaps, these brave fellows who landed in Gallipoli, was in the image of what I'd call old Australia, those pioneer values which made it possible for the white man to plant his civilization here. Physical strength, physical courage, a great emphasis on what's so-called manliness, a great emphasis on mateship, and ultimately some emphasis on equality. Now, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with any of these, except that they're no longer relevant today. I mean, after all, certainly, if you talk about mateship, you're eliminating one half of the population. You're eliminating all women. If you talk a lot about, as they talked a lot about, the virtues of British civilization and so on, we're no longer just an outpost of British civilization. We are an Australian nation in our own right. We are now composed of the Aborigines, the Asians, the British, and the Europeans. And we've got somehow, as I said, to learn to live together. But we can learn a lot from the heroism of these chaps and from their dedication to what they saw was the good life.
Well, Bill Gammage, heroism, dedication, have we made them too special over the years? Have we made them unique? I mean, some say the Australians were no better or worse than others at Gallipoli.
I think in terms of courage and bravery, readiness to die and so on. The Australians were no better or worse than all the other soldiers who were there on both sides. I think they thought in themselves that they had an edge because they had the values of old Australia, that resource, that self-reliance and so on. They were skills that they thought would be come in handy on a place like Anzac.
The British, when they first saw them, were a bit astonished, didn't they? They thought they were giants, blonde giants from another world.
Yeah, the British talked about their size and their confidence, I think. Why they were admiring their sort of giant statue is because of the confidence with which they moved and so on. People, British observers, spoke like that. But of course the British are also, I'm not saying they're wrong, but they are wanting to show the strength of an empire rallying in a crisis. What was, I think, was unique about the Australians was a sense that they were making a nation. Some of them had that sense before the 25th of April, and more of them had it after.
Even before they got there, they had that sense of nation building.
Yes, there's one soldier I know of who said on the 24th of April, this is going to be Australia's chance to make a name for herself. She comes out of this with the eyes of the world on her.
And of course the ordeal makes them greater than they actually were in real life.
Mm. Well, it didn't take long for the Australians to gain immense self-respect and the respect of their allies. Indian soldiers called them the White Gurkhas, and a Scottish soldier wrote, "No troops in the world can have fought better." It was as though they were on trial before the world, and the ordeal began as soon as they touched that fatal shore.
The bugs all falling, getting killed as soon as they hit the beach, getting killed in the boat too. And then I got up there. How I got up, I don't know, but the bugs had fallen left and right too, and I put the trenching tool in front of my head. I thought I'd get. We had no trenches, you know. I thought I'd get hit with the bullets. Oh, Christ, it was disorder. All mixed up with the 9th Battalions, and we'd be with our mobs all over the shop.
Well, we were about a mile and a half off the course, and we landed in a sort of a gully. Consequently, it was all virgin country. We had to put ourselves up, you know, from parts of the different plants that were there, and that's how we made contact. I think if we had landed where we were first intended to land, I don't think anyone would have been left, because they'd have knocked us over like fight-the-cocks.
Well, Bill Gammage, it was pretty rugged and forlorn country, and the Aussies didn't think that much of it, did they?
Oh, it was terrible country. Steep, poor soil, thick scrub.
Not too good for farming.
Not well. That's right. One bloke landed and he said, "This is bloody poor farming country. It wouldn't run a bandicoot to the square mile." And I think he's probably a bit tough on the bandicoot at that.
Mm. Manning, do you think this sort of rough country gave some of them echoes of the Australian bush and the sort of struggles they'd had there?
Oh, I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did. I think we've got to remember very importantly about this, that these chaps were familiar with failure. The white man, ever since he came here in 1788, became familiar with failure. The landscape of Australia, the environment of Australia, the climate of Australia was harsh and inhospitable. And I think that what Gallipoli bit deep into the Australian national consciousness was this sense of failure. But of course,
it wasn't seen as a failure at the time.
Oh, no. It's achieving glory in failure. But of course, that's a world which is quite different from ours, because we don't need to have that sense of physical failure now. We have the technical equipment, the technology with which we impose our wishes on the environment. Our danger is quite a different thing, that this technology we've got now might completely destroy our environment.
But there was a feeling then of, well, what could you expect, was there? I mean, life's always going to deal you a dud hand.
Yes, you're going to be beaten in the end. But the real test is how you respond to this. And this, I think, is the great thing, in some ways, the great thing about Gallipoli, that these chaps who survived that terrible ordeal not only achieved a measure of glory for themselves, but they transcended the material world. They became, as it were, transfigured by the experience.
Bill Gammage, we hear a lot about mateship in Gallipoli. How real was it, and how important was it to them in the battle for survival?
Well, in one way, mateship's a response to failure, isn't it? I mean, it's
drawing you together.
Yeah, we pull together or we'll go down separately. And all soldiers have it for that reason. All soldiers have it, not only
Did ours
Australian.
have it more than the others there?
Well, I think they made a particular virtue of it. You can find examples of comradeship in the German army and mateship in other armies. What the Australians did was make it a ship, mateship, as it were, an abstract ideal. I don't know that they had it any stronger than other armies, but they did make it part of their code, as it were. They put it in there.
And it did help them?
Pantheon. It helps all soldiers. It helped the Turks, and it certainly helped the Australians, yes. It was one of their great virtues.
Manning, they did develop, didn't they, a real pride in themselves. Mm-hmm. Did this flow back to Australia? Did we feel more proud of ourselves as a result back then?
Yes, I think the experience at Gallipoli and in the First World War in general gave Australians an awareness of themselves as Australians, which they probably hadn't had before, and also gave them a sort of confidence in their own abilities, same sort of thing as the Australians had acquired from their skill in cricket.
But of course the manliness and heroism of those days soon succumbed to the sort of mechanised war of the machine gun, didn't
it? Quite right. I mean, it was possible to think of this as heroic. I mean, the German soldiers did too, and the French soldiers and the Russian soldiers and the Italians, they all thought this war is heroic, war is chivalrous and so on. But what actually happened was that war became horrible, war became mechanised. Gallipoli did have some of this hand-to-hand stuff and climbing up a cliff and so on, which Aussies are familiar with. But by the time these chaps got to France, then the mechanisation of warfare, the impersonalisation of it, completely changed the whole thing. And if I may just add the point, I think really, ultimately, there is a chance that war became so horrible, beginning with 1914-18, and then 1939-45, with the dropping of the atomic bomb, that's a great chance for humanity. It may cure us all, finally, of fighting.
Well, what were the qualities that helped them endure their ordeal? The Prime Minister has talked of a simple but deep commitment to one another, each to his fellow Australian. A commitment that today, as much as ever, defines what it is to be an Australian. But how do we today relate to a commitment that at times seemed like suicide? For example, the Australian charge into the Turkish guns at the neck on the morning of August 7, 1915, the mass sacrifice portrayed in the film Gallipoli.
Steady, lads! Wait for it!
I never remember a soldier refusing to go to his death on the field.
Lionel Simpson was in the first wave, carrying a plank to throw over the Turkish barbed wire.
Well, Bill Gammage, here's a hard one. Why on earth did they do it? How can men do that?
I don't know why they did it, Paul. How can anyone now say? I can only speculate that they decided that it was better to go over and die with their mates than stay alive by themselves in the safety of the trench.
And live forever with the fact that they didn't go themselves?
Spend the next 75 years knowing they did that. But I don't know.
Well, talking of going, let's now go to Lone Pine at Gallipoli and the Prime Minister.
Veterans, distinguished guests. The landings on Gallipoli 75 years ago were followed by 8 months of untold sacrifice and suffering, which were to claim the lives of more than 100,000 men of the armies of Turkey, Germany, France, Britain, India, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. No place on the Gallipoli Peninsula was more fiercely contested than these few acres where we now stand. Known to the Anzacs, who captured it as Lone Pine, and to the Turkish soldiers who defended it to the last as the Ridge of Blood. In 3 days of literally hand-to-hand combat in August 1915, more than 2,000 Australians and 5,000 Turks died here, and 7 of the 9 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians at Gallipoli were won here. In a unique act of honour to fallen foes, the people and the government of Turkey have dedicated this ground as a memorial to the 8,700 Australians who died on Gallipoli. In making this pilgrimage today, we first pay the tribute of honour to the fallen of Turkey, fighting on their own soil, dying in defence of their homeland, inspired by the indomitable leadership of a man of destiny, Mustafa Kemal, known to history as Kemal Ataturk. My friends, let it be said at once, for us, the people of Australia and New Zealand, the heirs to Anzac, the meaning of Gallipoli can never be measured by mere numbers of the slain. In those terms, Gallipoli was but an initiation to the killing fields of France and of Flanders. And let it be said also that none of us come here to glorify war. For us, no place on earth more grimly symbolises the waste and the futility of war, this scene of carnage in a campaign which failed. It is not the waste of war in which Australians find the meaning of Gallipoli, then or now. And I say then or now for a profound reason. For the meaning of the Anzac tradition, forged in the fires of Gallipoli, must be learned anew from generation to generation. Its meaning can endure only as long as each new generation of Australians finds the will to reinterpret it, to breathe, as it were, new life into the old story, and in separating the truth from the legend, realise its relevance to a nation and to a people, experiencing immense change over the past 3/4 of a century. And in the continuing quest for the real meaning of Anzac, our way is lit by the shining presence here today of this small band of the first Anzacs who have returned. This is for all of us here and for all of our fellow Australians at home an honour, an experience, an emotion which goes beyond all words. But these men here, they know the truth of Gallipoli. They would be the last to claim that they were heroes, but indeed they were. They did not pretend to fathom the deep and the immense tides of history which brought them to these shores at the crossroads of civilization, so far from home and so far from all they knew and that they loved. They did not see themselves as holding in their hands the destiny of 6 mighty empires, all now vanished, nor could they begin to imagine that the vast and terrible forces unleashed upon the world in 1914 would still be working their way through human history 75 years on. But if they knew not those things, they did know 2 things. First, that they had a job to do, and they knew that in the end they could only rely on each other to see it through. They knew that they depended on their mates. The official Australian war historian, Charles Bean, expresses it in this way, and I quote him: "To be the sort of man who would give way when his mates were trusting to his firmness, to be the sort of man who would fail when the whole force and the cause required his endurance, to have made it necessary for another unit to do his own unit's work, That was the one prospect which these men could not face. Standing upon that alone, when help failed and hope faded, when the end loomed clear in front of them, when the whole world seemed to crumble and the heaven to fall in, they faced its ruin undismayed. In that recognition of the special meaning of Australian mateship, the self-recognition of their dependence upon one another, these Australians, by no means all of them born in Australia, drawn from every walk of life and different backgrounds, cast upon these hostile shores 12,000 miles from home, there in that mateship lay the genesis of the Anzac tradition. And at the heart of that tradition lay a commitment. It was a simple but a deep commitment to one another, each to his fellow Australian. And in that commitment, I believe, lies the enduring meaning of Anzac then and today and in the future. It is that commitment now as much as ever. Now, with all the vast changes occurring in our nation more than ever, it is that commitment to Australia which defines and alone defines what it is to be an Australian. That commitment is all. When the order was given for the evacuation from Gallipoli in December 1915, it is recorded that many of the Australians expressed their grief at leaving the graves of so many thousands of their mates in hostile hands. One of them said, "I hope they don't hear us going down the gullies." In all the story of heroism and human waste that was Gallipoli, nothing is more honourable than the custodianship of this hallowed ground by the people and the government of Turkey for 75 years. Australia does not forget. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
The Leader of the Opposition, Dr. Hewson. Prime Minister, Anzac veterans, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. 75 years ago, in these very hills, the first Anzacs forged a national legend. It is humbling and yet inspiring to commemorate that achievement together with some of those original Anzacs here in front of me, here today. Standing alongside them this morning in the dawn light at Anzac Cove, I was moved, deeply moved by the haunting beauty and by the sense of peace. But only you, the Anzacs, can know just how different it was then. It is hard for us to imagine what it was like this day 75 years ago when these hills echoed to the sounds of desperate battle. It is harder still to imagine that in this small space, 2,000 Australian soldiers died in just 3 to 4 days in the struggle for Lone Pine. Now all here is silent, yet nothing is forgotten. All here is peaceful, yet everything is remembered. Old enemies are now reconciled. Old mates are still as close as ever. The heroes of our first Anzac Day have a special place in the heart of all Australians. We feel a special pride at the mention of the word Gallipoli. What the Anzacs achieved here exemplifies all that is best in our Australian character. The sense of mateship, the toughness, the resourcefulness, the independence. Indeed, our national character was shaped by their actions here at Gallipoli. We will never forget the appalling conditions and the impossible odds they faced here. We all continue to be stirred by the courage that they showed. Their heroism proved us as a nation to ourselves and proved our country to the world. But our remembrance today should not be just a matter of history. It must be the very essence of our future. I belong to a very fortunate generation of Australians that has been spared the horrors of World War. The sacrifices of the Anzacs and others who fought for Australia since have bought the freedoms and bought the opportunities that we now enjoy. To them, our debt is great, but we owe them much more than just gratitude. We now have a responsibility, a clear responsibility, to live up to the example of courage and patriotism that they set. We have a special responsibility to build an Australia worthy of the ideals for which you fought. To me, the real significance of what was achieved here at Gallipoli lies in what it means for our future. The challenge for us now is to draw strength from the Anzac example, to have the courage, the faith and the will to create an even stronger Australian nation, one bound by an abiding belief in equality, fairness, opportunity and freedom. A nation we will be proud of, a nation the world will respect. Let us hope that the momentous events of the past year, which have lessened confrontation in Europe, lead to a lasting peace in the world. And let us ensure that Australia's sons and daughters will never again be thrown into the cauldron of war. As we endeavour to build an Australia for the 21st century, the Anzac example, here 75 years ago, will always be an inspiration for us. Their sacrifice must not have been in vain.
Well, Manning Clark, the Prime Minister has talked of a commitment to each other and to Australia that defines our Australianness. Dr. Hewson has said that our national character was shaped by the actions at Gallipoli. How do you respond to those sentiments?
Well, I think they're the right sort of sentiments. I don't think anyone would quarrel with the sentiments. But I think what is really relevant and what they didn't really look at is we now live in a completely different world. And I think the significance of Gallipoli for us is as a source of inspiration, a source of knowledge on who we were, who we used to be, and an opportunity for us to have a look at the much bigger question, what can we be now in 1990? We must be tremendously grateful and eternally grateful to those people who gave us, who fought so marvellously at Gallipoli. But we live in a different world. We shouldn't go on borrowing ideas from the old world. You'll notice that tonight they quote those marvellous words of Lawrence Binion. And they also quote regularly today, lest we forget. Now, I happen to believe passionately as an Australian that in the future, if there was ever another great crisis in Australia, that the words would come out of Australia. They would be Australian words, they'd be spoken by Australians about Australians.
So we need to say more, Bill Gammage, than it's enough to be like the Anzacs?
Yes, I agree entirely with Manning. 1915 is not 1990. In 1915, those Anzacs were thinking of the future. We can thank them best, we can honour them best, and we can remember them best if we do the same and think of the future of Australia.
But they have made us different?
Yes, they helped us to grow up. But I think we've still got a bit to go. We've got now we want to take with us into the future all the best and the baggage from the past. We want to take Dad and Dave and Mother from Steel Rudd. We want to take Henry Lawson's Mrs. Spicer. We want to take the heroes of Gallipoli. But now we're in a different world, and we've got to create the world in our own image. We've got to have the courage to do that, and I believe we will.
They taught us to detest war, and they taught us that we can't afford to lose men such as they were. But, as I say, Australia is a different country, and we should look to the future.
Gentlemen, thanks to both of you. Well, in the end, it is important to sift the sands of Gallipoli to try to separate the reality from the myth. Of course, every nation needs its myths, and this is a fine one of courage, endurance and mateship, a myth that deserves immense respect, like the men who created it. But are the lessons of 1915 enough for the vastly different Australia of the 1990s? After all, 1915 showed how easily we allowed our national interest, the building of a prosperous and truly egalitarian society, to be diverted by other interests, diverted with the sacrifice of an entire generation. The best hope, of course, is that if we learn well the lessons of the past, learn the difference between commemorating the fallen and glorifying war, then our children will never have to relive the ordeal of the Anzacs, the ordeal of showing you can die game. That leaves the other great challenge bequeathed to us by the diggers, the challenge to live game. That's all for tonight. Thanks to my guests, and thanks to you for your company. Good night.
Did the rifles fire as they lowered you down? Did the bugles sing the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flutes of the fall? Did the bugles sing the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flutes of the fall?
Author of The Broken Years, a study of the diggers in the Great War. As I said, we'll be crossing live to Lone Pine at any moment, but first, what were they like and who were they? Those young men who landed at Anzac Cove on that ominously still morning in 1915. Here's an extract from the Four Corners documentary, The Fatal Shore.
You had that feeling that you had to go. That's the feeling I had, and I was in pretty good nick too. As the bloke said at the recruiting officers, by Joseph, says, you're in pretty good nick. So I should be.
So I went up this line there, and I was rejected on account of my height. Not medically, but on account of my height. What I did, I walked right round, got to the other end of the other line, and went up and was passed through in the one hole in the one time.
Living in Port Melbourne, you know, you notice all these passenger ships going abroad, and that's one thing I did have in mind. I'd love to be on one of those ships one of these days. Little did I know that there was going to be a war on, and little did I know I was going to be in a uniform.
And the band played waltzing Matilda as the ship pulled away from the quay. And amidst all the cheers, the flag waving and tears, we sailed off for Gallipoli.
Well, in a few minutes, with a lot of technology and a little luck, we'll be crossing live to Lone Pine to hear those historic speeches by Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Opposition Leader Dr. John Hewson. Speeches in which the two leaders will seek to link the Anzac legend of the past with the Australia of today and tomorrow. And here in Canberra, we'll try to examine those links too, asking questions like, are we, the Australians of today, really different because of the heroic nightmare of Gallipoli 75 years ago? To tackle such questions, I've been joined by Professor Manning Clark, our nation's most eminent historian, and Bill Gammage, historical advisor to the film Gallipoli and author
in the past. And I think the way people immediately after Gallipoli saw these chaps, these brave fellows who landed in Gallipoli, was in the image of what I'd call old Australia, those pioneer values which made it possible for the white man to plant his civilization here. Physical strength, physical courage, a great emphasis on what's so-called manliness, a great emphasis on mateship, and ultimately some emphasis on equality. Now, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with any of these, except that they're no longer relevant today. I mean, after all, certainly if you talk about mateship, you're eliminating one half of the population. You're eliminating all women. If you talk a lot about, as they talked a lot about, the virtues of British civilization and so on, we're no longer just an outpost of...
Well, Bill Gammage, what were those young men like and why did they set sail? Was it adventure, patriotism, what?
Well, I think they would have felt patriotism and duty, of course, especially after they enlisted. There's always a beer in those sorts of emotions, and they genuinely did feel them. But if I had to put my finger on one thing, I'd say that they were fit young men and confident. Of course, ignorant about what was going to happen, but confident that they were going to win.
And off for a big adventure?
Off for a big adventure, more or less like being odds-on in a grand final, I'd say.
Manning Clark, the British commander, General Hamilton, described them as gladiators with the eye of children. This implies a sort of innocence abroad, doesn't it? And this has been part of the story for generations.
Yeah, well, I think, you see, every generation, Paul, creates the past in its own image. It sees itself reflected